Hey everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Coffee with Thorben. It's great to be back. So last week we were not able to host the stream here because, I was spending about a week, actually 3 days plus traveling at my old employer to teach a workshop there. We talked 2 days about Hibernate performance tuning and another day about microservices, and it was a lot of fun. But teaching a workshop and spending the night at a hotel doesn't really line up with the live stream. So it's great to be back. I hope you're doing well. And so what's the plan for this week or for today's stream? Over the last 3 weeks, I was pretty busy with teaching workshops, doing client work, and catching up with all the most important things in between. And due to that, I have a bunch of comments, especially on the blog, that I would like to answer. So I will work on that today during this stream and share the questions and answers with you. And I'm looking forward to answering your questions. So if you have anything you want to ask me about Hibernate, feel free to post them in the chat and I will pick the questions from there. So let's transition to the browser window. Let's start with the first one. I will just work on the most recent questions. So there will be a few that are rather simple and straightforward, and others that are probably a little bit more complicated. So here I explained how to use left join and fetch join in a criteria query. Just to remind you what needs to be done there. So a simple join is just calling the join method on the root interface or on a join interface. And if you want to do a left or a right join, then you need to provide the join type as the second parameter to the join method. And if you want to do fetch, then you call the fetch instead of the join method. Okay, so what was the question? Hi, I got Java X persists, no result exception, already found for query with root cause, exception with joint fetch query. How can we solve this problem? Okay, let's reply to that. If there's no entity found for that query, then there are either there are two pretty common reasons. Either the joint fetch doesn't return any records, which means a joint fetch resides in an inner join in the query. So maybe there are no associated records, or the where condition exclude all records from the result set. And if you then do a get single result, then Hibernate throws an exception. So let me quickly write that, and then I will answer the question from Varam about equals and from Niroshan about equals and hashcode. So hi Bila, that's most likely either because the join fetch added an inner join to your query and there are no associated entities, or your where conditions were not matched by any record in your DB. If it's caused by the join fetch clause, please try a left join fetch clause. So this was the criteria API. I'm pretty sure that we can set that on the fetch method as a second parameter. Let me quickly check that. Well, basically any criteria query will do. So where is it? Here. Here we have a few criteria queries. Okay, and we then have a root interface, fetch, yeah, join type. And join type then is join type left. Attribute. Okay, let's use this, write everything here, and go back to the test. Okay, so Niroshan asks, I hope you would do a lesson for importance of equals and hashcode methods of entity classes in JPA. Yeah, well, in most cases, I would suggest that you don't implement the equals and hashcode method. Because if you don't need to merge existing, so if you don't need to merge entities that you get from a client back into your persistence context, then the equals and hashcode methods provided by the object class is more than good enough. And implementing equals and hashcode in a way that it's compliant with the JPA spec and with the Java requirements isn't that easy. If you send entity objects to the client and get them back so that you can merge them into your persistence context, then you need to implement equals and hashcode. And hashcode should return a static value, 13, 42, whatever you want, and the equals method should compare the type and the primary key attributes, no other attributes, and if the primary key attribute is null, the records are always not equal. I explained that in great detail in an article. Let me quickly search for it and then I post it in the chat. Pretty sure I had an article about that. There it is. So implementing equals and hashcode. Okay. So next question, Varam. I'm just starting learning Hibernate. What should I know about it? Any useful tips or learning resources? Sure. So if you want to have a structured, well-rounded introduction to JPA and Hibernate, I recommend to take a look at my JPA for Beginners course. That one focuses on all the basics you need to know. And if you don't want to purchase a course and prefer to learn on your own, then this article that I just pasted in the chat is probably a good starting point. So you should know about standard mapping annotations like entity, table, column, and the many-to-one, one-to-many, many-to-many, one-to-one annotations for associations. And you should know about JPQA queries, and you need to know about the lifecycle model. That's an essential thing that often gets missed by developers who are new to Hibernate because you don't see the lifecycle model. It's an internal feature of JPA and Hibernate, but it's essential. Depending on the lifecycle, your persistence provider, in this case Hibernate, decides when and which kind of SQA statements need to be executed. And it's essential to understand how this works and what it actually means if an entity is managed, what happens during a flush and so on. I explain all of that in my JPA for Beginners course, but you can also find information about that on the blog. Tomasz, hi, what would be best way to initialize few child entities mapped as bidirectional one-to-many for a single parent? Well, Tomasz, that depends on the number of associations you want to initialize. If these few child entities are all, well, if it's a hierarchy of two with two levels, the parent and a list of childs below that, and if it's just one association, then the answer for sure is a joint fetch clause or an entity graph. If we are talking about multiple associations, then the answer is a little tricky. You said there are just a few child entities, so if there are not too many, then you can probably use multiple joint fetch clauses within your query. You then need to make sure that you model your associations as a set instead of a list to avoid multiple backfetch exceptions. But then you can joint fetch multiple associations within one query. The issue with multiple joint fetch clauses, and that is why some people say that you shouldn't use a joint fetch clause for more than one association, is that a joint fetch clause resides in a join in your query, and all the columns of the fetched entity get added to the select clause, and that creates a product. If you have authors and books, and you joint fetch the books for an author, and an author has written 3 books, then you will get 3 records in your reside set: author with book 1, author with book 2, author with book 3. And if you do that with multiple associations, then you multiply that even further, and that quite quickly gets out of hand, which then causes other performance issues because the reside set is just too big. So if you're running into that issue, then you should take a look at the article that I just wrote about the multiple back fetch exceptions. I'm pretty sure that I explained it there. Where is it? There. I paste the link into the chat, so let's take a quick look at that. So multiple backfetch exception is exactly an issue that shows up in these situations. So if you have multiple too many associations and you model them as lists, as I do here at the beginning, then you get a multiple backfetch exception. And that's obviously bad. You can solve that by changing the attribute type to set. And I need to double check why we lost the type information here. Anyways, if you map both associations as a set, then you can use multiple joint fetch clauses like I do here in your query. And then you need to think about adding a distinct and a pass distinct through. But there are a few details. The general idea is use multiple joint fetch clauses, and you can see the result here. You get a lot of joins down here, and the selection gets extended. And because of that, multiple joint fetchers become an issue. Well, it can become an issue. It depends on the number of elements within each association. So here I'm joining from the book to the author and from book to the review. And we're joining from the book to the author and fetching that association in should be okay in most situations. I mean, how many authors write a book together, right? If it's not an encyclopedia, or if it's not a collection of research papers or stuff like that, then you shouldn't have too many authors. I mean, normally you have 1, 2, 3 authors who wrote a book together. So join fetching that isn't a big deal. And you could then, for example, join fetch the publisher as well, because there's just one publisher. So in the end, you would get 3 records in the result set. But the joint fetch of the reviews association is most likely an issue. If you look at bigger online bookstores, then you have a few thousand reviews for a book, and that will blow up your result set. In these situations, it's better to split your query into multiple parts. So here I'm joint fetching a book with its authors, and down here I'm selecting a book and joint fetch the reviews. So now I have 2 queries that return the same set of books and that join different associations. And because of Hibernate's first level cache and the guarantee that you only get 1 object representation of each record, you now get a book entity object with an initialized list of authors and an initialized list of reviews. And yeah, the question here from a performance point of view now is what has the bigger performance impact? Executing 2 queries like I do here, and the whole overhead of processing a query and network transfer and all these kind of things, or the size of the product that we would create if we join fetch the authors and the reviews to a given book. And that is something that I can't answer without knowing your domain model and the data that you are actually storing in the database. And that's the reason why I say, okay, there are actually 2 ways to solve these kind of situations, and you need to decide for your application which one is the right one. Yeah, I've posted the link to the chat. Thomas, please take a look at that, and if there are any questions remaining, then feel free to ask here, or join next week's live stream and let's discuss about it then. So what else do we have? Oh. Okay, I was asked to increase the font size. Did it now? Sorry, didn't see that request earlier. Miroslav, hi Thorben. How often do you use inheritance and mapping strategies in Hibernate? Is this feature redundant and create more complexity due to ORM mismatch problem? Well, I wouldn't say it's redundant, but I try to not use it too often because, yeah, there's a mismatch between the object-oriented world and the relational world in the database. The concept of inheritance doesn't exist in a relational database, at least not in the relational table model. Some databases support proprietary inheritance features, but well, you can't model the same kind of association that you can't model a clear inheritance association as you know from Java in a relational model. That concept just doesn't exist. And due to that, we have a gap there that Hibernate needs to bridge, and we have a few concepts to do that. That's a huge topic of the advanced Hibernate online training. To make the answer short, I see that in a lot of projects. Every now and then I use it myself, and it's a great thing for your Java domain model. Just make sure that you understand the different inheritance strategies supported by JPA and Hibernate, and what it actually means on the database side. If you put all your records into if you use the single table strategy, for example, and store all records in one table and have lots of null values in certain columns, or what it actually means if you need to join multiple database tables whenever you fetch a subclass. So yeah, Miroslav, you seem to be a little bit skeptical about the inheritance mapping strategies with Hibernate, and I agree with you that this is something you need to think about and where you need to be sure that you actually understand what you're doing there. But in most projects, it isn't really that big of a deal, and it's a feature that's actually used. Yeah. Okay, and then Niroshan asks how to execute criteria queries using Springdale JPA repository. Well, you would need to implement your own query method in your repository, and there you can then use the criteria API. Please take a look at the Springdale JPA documentation. There's a pretty good explanation of that. I'm actually not sure if I ever wrote about that. We have something about derived queries and custom queries, but I think so far I didn't wrote about that. Maybe I should change that. Let me quickly check. Maybe I find something. No. No, I'm sorry. I can just recommend the official documentation of Springdale JPA. But I'm pretty sure that they have a clear example about that. So the approach there would be implement your own query method within your repository, and please reference the official documentation for that. Matt, hi Mr. Jensen, hope you're doing fine. I'm doing great. I hope you're doing good as well. And then Niroshan asks how to detach and merge using Springdale JPA, where the most common approach to detach an entity is just to return it to the client, so send it outside of the of your current JVM or the container, and then the JPA repository actually supports the merge use case. Yeah, provides a method for that. Matt wrote, can we just create scalable application with just JDBC in 2020, or do I have to master JPA? Yes, you can of course create scalable applications with plain JDBC, so SQL over JDBC. But the JDBC API is a quite tricky one, so I wouldn't recommend doing that. You are way more productive if you put a little bit of effort into learning JPA by reading the Hibernate documentation, articles here on the blog, maybe take a look at my JPA for Beginners course, or watching YouTube videos on my channel about it. And you should be able to get up to speed within a reasonable amount of time. And then your productivity using JPA will be way higher than with plain JDBC. If you want to have more control over your SQL statements, I would recommend to take a look at either Jooq, JOOQ.org, which is a great Java DSL implemented by Lukas Eder for SQL statements, or maybe take a look at Springdale JDBC, which is an interesting project, which is a little bit closer to the JDBC layer, implemented by Jens Schauder from Pivotal. Hey Hopcroft, good to see you. Then Ishan wrote transactional to avoid dirty read, phantom read, and please explain about transaction locking strategies and transaction isolation. Oh, that's a huge topic that's a little bit too complex and too long to explain that here on the stream without any slides or other materials to support my points. But in general, with the standard transaction isolation levels set by your JPA spec and by I would say all commercial databases, you can be sure that that all changes that you perform within one transaction are encapsulated within that transaction. So you don't see if you have two transactions in parallel, you don't see what gets changed in that other transaction. And then Hibernate ensures a repeatable read behavior for all entity objects. If the entity got fetched once within your current transaction, then you can be sure that you get the same object when you read it again. And in general, this avoids the different, that avoids most of the transaction isolation issues. Thomas wrote, as for joint inheritance, what is your opinion on replacing it with single table inheritance and using secondary table for uncommon fields? No, I don't think I like that approach too well, but what I've seen is moving some data, modeling some data using a one-to-one association. So the issue with the secondary table is that you still have a join that gets performed when you fetch that specific entity class. Or maybe let's take a step back and explain what's the issue with single table inheritance and fields that are null most of the time. You get a pretty unbalanced database table, so there are lots of gaps in the data and in columns that are null. And well, that's something that your DBA can explain in more detail. But this situation isn't ideal for your database and how it manages and stores the data in the file system. And that in itself can cause performance issues, or is at least something that your DBA needs to know about, so that they can address that when they set up the database and the database optimizations. So you could avoid that by moving these columns to different table, and that you would achieve that with the joint strategy, where you have a database table that maps all columns of the superclass, and then you have a specific table for each subclass that only contains the additional columns, and then you get a pretty balanced database tables. What I've seen, if you don't want to use the joint inheritance strategy, which always requires a join if you fetch one of these entities, is I've seen projects where we had the single table strategy for the whole inheritance hierarchy, and then we had a few records, a few entity classes that had a specific one-to-one association to another table that got fetched lazily for additional fields. I don't really like that approach, but it works okay. Okay, I have these two ones. Andre asks, Concur and Juke. We used that with Lambda AWS, where you don't use caching. Easy to understand, great performance. Yeah, I totally agree. Juke is great if you are looking for a way to write your own SQL statements within Java. And I showed on the blog, I think the article was called Hibernate in Juke, a match made in heaven or something like that. How to use both of them together. The general idea is to create your query with Juke and then execute, then get the query from Juke and execute it as a native query within Hibernate. And that works really well. Then another question from Niroshan. In Hibernate, is there any built-in mechanism for recover soft deleted records with its children? The only thing you can do, so a soft delete works by filtering based, well, you add a status to your record and you change that status to delete it if you want to remove a record, if you want to soft delete a record. And then you exclude all records with the state deleted in all your queries. So that's the general idea of a soft delete. You're not removing the record from the database, you're just hiding it. And the only way with Hibernate to get these records back would be to write a JPQL or criteria update statement and change the status of that record. But then you need to handle the whole graph of entities yourself. So you would need to update the records in each table with a separate statement. But yeah, that would be the approach there. And then another question by Niroshan: how to set a generation strategy or custom generator for non-ID field? I get that question quite often, and unfortunately you can't use the generation strategy with a non-ID field. The generated value annotation is, if you look at the JPA spec, is only allowed for ID attributes. It's not required to be supported for any other attributes. And I'm pretty sure that Hibernate doesn't support it on any non-ID attributes. So yeah, there you would need to use a lifecycle listener, for example, or some other approach to update that. Okay. Let me... Oh, no. There's the next question. So this is an article about the about JPA's attribute converter. And Jochen asks, hi Thorben, you already wrote about the exceptions concerning converting an ID attribute. Are there workarounds or official ways to convert, example, a string to a new UID or vice versa? We had to switch our underlying database from Postgres to DB2, which does not support UUIDs natively, so we have to convert these right now. Oh, that's bad. You can't do that with an attribute converter. Can you do that with a user type? I don't know. Did any one of you try to use a user type to convert a primary key attribute? Hibernate, user type, primary key. Does that work? I don't know. I haven't used that yet. Oh, that's .org ORM. Oh. ORM. Let's quickly check the documentation on that. I would guess it doesn't work. But if there's a way to do that, then it has to be the user type. User type. No? Spelling it wrong. Implementing a user type. Yeah, there is user type. Okay. User type. Okay, I will check that later or if anyone of you has some suggestions there, but I'm pretty sure that it doesn't work in general. So, got another question from Neoshan. At prepossessed, guaranteed managed transaction. I'm not exactly sure if I understand the question. Yes, the prepossessed code, the code in the prepossessed callback will be part of the transaction. That's the question. Miroslav wrote, I read that foreign keys in two tables referencing each other are just two unidirectional relations. With map by, these tables are related on Hibernate side as object references. Is this correct? Don't know if I understand the question. I read that foreign keys in two tables referencing each other are just two unidirectional relations. Yes, so in a relation table model, the foreign key is just a unidirectional relation to the other table. That's right. And if you have one on both ends, then there are just two of them. With map by, these tables are related on Hibernate side. Is this correct? With map by, you don't need a foreign key column on both entities. Well, in fact, you don't have them. The bidirectional mapping with Hibernate is something that's provided by the abstraction of your object relational mapping. You have an owning and a referencing side. The owning side maps the database table that contains the foreign key column in a many-to-one association. It maps the many side. And the referencing side just tells Hibernate, okay, this association is defined on that other entity, and the bidirectional mapping itself is handled as part of the abstraction and not as part of the table model. Matt asks, if you have a one-to-many association, is it better to use the one-to-many on the parent side or the many-to-one on the child side? You should always map with... If you're working with a many-to-one association, then there are two ways to map that one efficiently. You can either model a unidirectional many-to-one association, or you can map a bidirectional many-to-one, one-to-many association. In both cases, you need to define the association on the many side, which contains the foreign key column. Please don't use a unidirectional one-to-many association. I explained that in an article on the blog. Hibernate handles that inefficiently and requires additional update statements. And yeah, it's better to always map it as a many-to-one or as a bidirectional association. Thomas asks how to enforce a JPQL query fetch of field that has lazy fetch settings with non-default lazy group through bytecode enhancement. It seems this field is always fetched in separate query. Yes, if you just fetch the entity, then that field gets fetched lazily with an additional query. That's right. I haven't tried it. What you could try is you could try to fetch your entity with an additional fetch graph and reference that lazily fetched attribute within the fetch graph. In theory, that should tell Hibernate to initialize that specific attribute. Hibernate should recognize that this one would otherwise be fetched lazily and then fetch it eagerly as part of the graph definition. But I'm not 100% sure. In general, if you use bytecode enhancement and lazy fetching for basic attributes, then yes, these are always fetched in additional queries. And there's not a lot you can do about that. Okay, lots of questions today. Let me try to answer another question from the comments on the blog. And here you're specifying order by over a hash set. Does it even make any sense? How to order the elements of a relationship? Yeah, yes, it makes sense because the hash set is only used when you instantiate the object yourself. Hibernate replaces it with its own set implementation that keeps the order. Yes, it makes sense because the hash set gets only used when you instantiate a new entity object. When you read it from the database, Hibernate uses its own set implementation, which keeps the defined order. Okay. Then I have another question here with, give me a second, and it's about entity graphs. So this article is about dynamically creating entity graphs using the Entity Graph API. You can see that here. So you can do a create entity graph to create the graph for an entity, then add subgraphs or attribute nodes to define the fetching behavior for that entity. And Thomas, that's something you could try to use for your lazily fetched association. Can you use entity graphs with refresh? No, you can't. Yeah. No, unfortunately, you can't use that with refresh. Okay. More questions here in the chat? No, not yet. Okay. If you have any questions, feel free to post them. If not, then I will pick one or two more questions from the blog, and then probably end this streams within the next 15 minutes. Oh yeah, that's an interesting one that might affect a few of you. And this one is about the mapping definitions in JPA and Hibernate. You can use annotations, XML files, or both. If you're using both, then Hibernate merges them and the XML mapping wins. Where is the comment that I just approved? There it is. My question is, can we use any tool plugin to convert XML-based mappings to annotation-based entity? If no available tool to achieve that, please guide on high-level steps. No, unfortunately, there currently is no tool. No, there is no tool at the moment. But you can factor one mapping after the other and use the annotation and XML based mappings in parallel. I wish you to test and keep using your application while migrating your mapping definitions. That's actually something that I used with a few customers so far, especially when they were still using the old Hibernate XML-based mappings, which I recommend to replace before you migrate to Hibernate 6, especially if you're using the old Hibernate criteria API. The old criteria API will get removed with Hibernate 6. The old XML mapping will not be removed, but the issue is that the JPA-based criteria API and the old Hibernate's proprietary criteria API handle the mappings differently. So there are a few defaults and configuration settings in Hibernate's old XML mapping that are conflicting with the JPA standard mapping definitions, and the old Hibernate criteria API uses the Hibernate specific mapping, and the new JPA-based criteria, JPA-defined criteria API uses the JPA defaults, and in the end you get a pretty unpredictable behavior within your persistence layer. I mean, you can always explain why Hibernate handles a certain case in a specific way, but the issue there is that it always feels like in one use case it works like this, and the next one it works differently, and that makes your persistence layer just really hard to maintain. Okay, yeah, Neoshan, my pleasure to answer the questions. Feel free to bring more questions next week, and take a look at the articles here on the blog and on my YouTube channel. I'm pretty sure that you will find material about almost all topics you might be interested in regards to JPA and Hibernate. Danielle wrote, "Hello Thorben, how can you safely evaluate if the loaded entity is a proxy or the full object outside the Spring's transactional boundaries without throwing the lazy exception? In Hibernate 4, when using Java Assist accessing one field of the proxy returned null. In Hibernate 5, it gives an error." Well, there are two things. First of all, I think you can check that with the Hibernate utils class. But the question here is, why are there any uninitialized or incompletely initialized objects outside of your transactional context? That shouldn't happen, and that's one of the reasons why I always recommend to use DTO objects in your API, and that's especially the case if it's a Java API and a Java client, because otherwise you run into exactly these kind of issues where you are wondering, okay, is this association initialized or not, and how to handle these cases. So yeah, that's just quite often that's a combination of a few unfortunate design decisions that should have avoided the host situation in general. Bilal asks, "Hi Torben, I want to one question. Can I use on predicate with joint fetch?" no, you shouldn't use any predicates on a join fetch. In theory, you can cast your fetch interface to the join interface with Hibernate, not because there's any connection between these two interfaces in the JPA spec or on an interface level, but in Hibernate they get implemented by the same class. So that works in theory, but that breaks the query that you are creating. Well, the query, you can still execute the query, but the join fetch clause is intended to be used to fetch all associated entities. So if you join fetch the books of an author, you expect to get all books this author has written. So if the author wrote a book about Java 8 and one about Hibernate, and you then use any predicate on the joint fetched association and filter the all books that contain the word Hibernate, then your query will not return the author with all her books. It will return the author with all her books that contain the word Hibernate, and that's not what you intended to do with the join fetch clause. With the join fetch, the association is supposed to be fully initialized with all elements. So you need a join fetch and a join in that case. Burut asks, is JPA adequate for performing large batches of inserts? In general, not. I mean, you can implement it, but the question there is why would you? Hibernate is good for all object relational use cases. So for all use cases that benefit from an object relational mapping, where you have graphs of entities, where you benefit from the lifecycle handling, where you benefit from caching and these kind of things. But if you're implementing a large batch insert, which quite often is a nightly job or something like that, in most cases, you don't need to work on a huge graph of entities. You don't need any caching because it's a write-once operation. And you don't need any lifecycle state management because you just want to insert that record. So there is no need to work with Hibernate or any other JPA implementation, and most likely also not with any other object relational mapping, because that use case doesn't benefit from any of the features that object relational mappings provide you. And then it's easier to just write plain SQL insert statements. It's more efficient, it's easier, and my general recommendation for large batch insert jobs, I mean, as always, you need to take a specific look at your application and that use case. Maybe there are reasons to work with an object relational mapper, but as a rule of thumb, large insert batch jobs are not a good fit for Hibernate, or the other way around. Matt wrote, please make more content about transaction management. That's the most aspect that I have a hard time understanding, and you make clear explanation. Thank you, first of all. And do you know this this article? It's about transaction management with Spring and Spring Data JPA. It's pretty basic. You might be familiar with all of it, but it's the most recent article that I wrote about transaction handling there. And then Thomas wrote, what is your opinion on bidirectional one-to-one versus unidirectional one with map ID? The latter seems to solve problem with eagerly fetch one-to-one association. Yes. Well, you can use both mappings. In general, I like the unidirectional one with the maps ID better. So what's the issue with the bidirectional one-to-one mapping? The issue there is that one entity maps the database table with the foreign key column and the other one doesn't. Lazy fetching works perfectly fine on the entity that maps the table with the foreign key column. It gets ignored on the other one. And now it depends on your domain model if that's an issue or not. Let's say where do I have a one-to-one association? Between a book and a manuscript. And let's say I store the foreign key of the manuscript in the book table, and I map it as a bidirectional one-to-one association, and I normally start with the book and have most read operations on the book. Then this approach is probably fine because all the read operations are performed on the entity that uses the lazy fetching for the association. That's awesome. Lazy fetching will not work on the manuscript entity. And there the question as well, is that an issue or not? In a lot of applications it is an issue. But let's assume you only get books and then you might get the manuscript for that one specific book and you're not performing any search operations on the manuscripts. Then using a bidirectional association is probably okay. Because, well, if you get the manuscript for a given book, then you already got the book anyways, you need both of them together, and it doesn't really matter if the lazy fetching from the manuscript to the book works or not. Excuse me. So yeah, if you're using a bidirectional one-to-one association, then lazy fetching doesn't work on one end of the association. And in most applications, that's an issue. If you can design it in a way that this isn't an issue, then a bidirectional association is amazing. If you need a bidirectional association mapping or some kind of bidirectional mapping and lazy fetching on both ends, then I prefer the unidirectional mapping with the maps ID. With that approach, both entities or both database records use the same primary key value, and the general idea is you just model a unidirectional association on the entity that maps the foreign key column, and you then use that foreign key column as the primary key value for that entity as well. So let's say I do that on the manuscript entity. The manuscript stores the foreign key to the book, and that's also the primary key value of the manuscript. Then I wouldn't have a model association on the book. And if I need to get the manuscript for a given book, then I would just do an entity manager find for the manuscript entity with the primary key value of my current book. Works perfectly fine. Provides us with the way to implement lazy fetching in both directions. Yeah, sure, when you're coming from the book and want to get the manuscript, requires another call of the entity manager find method, but that's totally fine. We basically have a lazy fetching behavior here, and from a performance point of view, that is the better approach. So yeah, to sum this whole answer up, if you want to have a mapping they can apply for all bidirectional one-to-one associations, then please use the unidirectional one with the maps ID. If you can and want to differentiate between certain situations and use cases in your application and especially in your domain model, then you can use a bidirectional mapping as well. But then you need to make sure that the entity that doesn't map the foreign key column isn't used too often. It's always used together with the other entity that references the foreign key column. Thomas, I hope that answers the question in a clear way. Okay. Yeah, streaming for almost an hour already. So let me take a quick look if I have a question here that I can answer quickly, and then we end the stream in a few minutes. Oh yeah, this is an interesting one. And one that's not will take too long to answer. If you're working with microservices, you should take a look at this Outbox Pattern with Hibernate article, and you see here you can also find a video about that on the channel. And then, what's the question? Probably was too Too fast when I opened the article. Um, So the idea with the outbox pattern is, there should be a diagram there. So you store all the messages that you want to send to other systems in a table called the outbox table. And that enables you to write all the changes within a local transaction to your database. And then you have a message relay service which gets the records from the outbox table and brings them to the message broker. And the question down here is, I never heard of it, does that mean that each microservice needs its own message relay service? If not, we would break the independence of the message relay service depends on service X and service Y. Yeah, that's right. Hi Daniel. That's correctly. Each service needs its own message relay service. If you use Debezium, multiple of them will be deployed on the same Kafka Connect instance, but they stay independent of each other. As you wrote, this is required to avoid any dependencies between your services. Okay, I quickly add a link to the Debezium article. There it is. Use Debezium. Okay. I would say that's it for today. So thanks for joining. Thanks for all the questions that you asked during the last 1 hour. This time we had a lot of questions. I really loved that. Yeah, thanks for joining. I will be back tomorrow with a pre-recorded video and next Wednesday with another live stream. And if you want to get more Hibernate content before that or for the weekend or anything, then I recommend to take a look at the webinar recording that I just uploaded. Yesterday evening I had the pleasure to be invited to the Red Hat Developer webinar series where I talked for 1 hour with Markus Eisele about Hibernate, performance tuning, and using Hibernate in complex projects. And I basically gave a quick rundown of a bunch of important performance tuning tools and Hibernate features and answered several questions about different performance related topics. So yeah, if you want more content, please take a look at that. And yeah, that's it for today. Have a great rest of the day, evening or beginning of the day, or whatever your current time is. Enjoy the rest of the day, stay healthy, and I hope you watch tomorrow's video. Bye!